Gordon Chang, great to see you again. I'm so glad to have you here on the Cain Podcast.
Thank you so much.
We've known each other for quite some time. So when I saw this tweet from you, it caught my attention, Gordon. I want to read it for the audience, and I'd love you to explain. You tweeted, after the stunning developments at the CCP's 20th National Congress, all of our assumptions about China look obsolete. We must now prepare for a perilous future. What did you mean by that tweet, Gordon?
The 20th National Congress, that was stunning. Some of the most extraordinary events in the history of the People's Republic, and all of them ominous. First of all, we saw Xi Jinping get his precedent-breaking third term. He also packed the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the highest decision-making body in China, all with his loyalists. So there are no dissenting voices at the top of the party. We know what he wants to do. He's a genocidal monster with the crimes against humanity, against the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, and others, his repression across China. And he is the most ambitious aggressor in history. He's been pressing these notions that China is the only legitimate state in the world. In other words, the United States is no more than a colony. And he also believes that the near parts of the solar system should be Chinese, so, part of the People's Republic of China. So there is no compromising with this figure. And yet we have a political establishment in our country and in other countries that are seeking accommodation with him when they should be preparing us for what he has been talking about. He was very clear in his work report to the 20th National Congress, which opened the event. He's talking about an ominous, grim future where no one threatens China, but he still talks about this. And he talks about annexing parts of China's periphery, especially Taiwan. He's told us what he's going to do. We have a political class that has very little sense of urgency.
Let's talk about that urgency. I've read reviews of that 20th National Congress, and it's notable how often he talked about security, as opposed to, for example, economy. Not that I think that he and China is leaving behind the power that they've accumulated through their economic might, but there was a notable emphasis on security. You mentioned not just Taiwan, but you mentioned the solar system. So let's define both the parameters of his ambition, which you began to, but also the timeline for his ambition.
Well, first of all, he has been pressing this notion of the mandate of heaven over Tianxia, or all under heaven. And Will, it's not only that Chinese rulers have a right to rule all under heaven, but that heaven compels them to do so. We have seen him talk about this subtly in the first decade of this century when he was not in power. And he's been clearer about this as his 10 years at the top of the Chinese political system. So there's no question about what he wants to do. In terms of timeline, he said in a number of things going back to 2019, when you start to put them all together, that he plans to annex Taiwan during his tenure. He talks about this must occur during the new era. That is essentially his code for his rule. And he also said something in 2019, which really is stunning. He said that the problem of Taiwan, and he calls it a problem, Will, he said this problem cannot be passed down from one generation to the next, which means that he's on an accelerated timeline. And this is something that we have not been willing to acknowledge in this country. We always say, well, yeah, he wants to do it, but we don't talk about the urgency that he obviously is expressing. He's telling us, he's telegraphing his punches. As James Lilly, our famous ambassador to Beijing, said, we're just determined not to listen.
Is that the trigger point, Gordon? I think for many listening, listen, we need to talk about various aspects of China and the way it's worked its way into our lives. But obviously at the forefront of anyone's imagination is when you say we have a perilous future, we envision a kinetic war between two world superpowers. A, is that what you envision? And B, is Taiwan the trigger point?
Taiwan could be the trigger point, but we know that, for instance, China has been pressuring the Philippines, trying to break it apart. And so we saw, for instance, repeated attempts, especially November and July of this year, where the Chinese were attempting to block resupply of a Philippine outpost at Second Thomas Shoal. This is after they seized Scarborough Shoal. And this is so serious that even Anthony Blinken, our see no evil Secretary of State, actually threatened the use of force twice, starting last November. And then we have the Chinese in Japanese territorial waters in the East China Sea. Chinese troops are already deep into Indian-controlled territory in Ladakh. So, yeah, it could be Taiwan, but it could be any place else. And we know the Chinese will take us by surprise. But, this is not necessarily kinetic war. So, for instance, last year, 77,000, maybe 78,000 Americans died from illegal fentanyl, either from fentanyl itself or fentanyl mixed with methamphetamines and cocaine. These come from the large, well-organized international fentanyl gangs that could not operate in China in China's near total surveillance state or total surveillance state, depending how you look at it. They couldn't operate without the blessing of the Communist Party. And by the way, these gangs actually launder their proceeds through the state banking system. So that's 78,000 Americans who have been murdered. And we are not willing to acknowledge that. And so that's war. When you kill, tens of thousands of Americans, with a deliberate act, I consider that war. I mean, the same thing about COVID-19. We could run through all of this, but this is a struggle. This is more than just what we think it is, and it's an existential struggle for us.
While we're on the note of COVID-19, Gordon, why has China taken a zero COVID policy, a zero COVID transmission policy, hard lockdowns on their citizens? Do they know something we do not about COVID, or are they simply using COVID as a tool to suppress their own population?
Well, by now it's clear that zero COVID is not working. So the conclusion is inescapable. They're using it, I believe, for two reasons. One of them is, as you point out, to control the Chinese people. The second is they're using this as a weapon against the United States. From the very first days of this pandemic, they were saying that their ability to control infections and deaths showed the superiority of Chinese communism over American democracy. So they believe that they can use this to undermine the faith in democracy, not only among the Chinese, but among Americans and others. So this is an attack on our form of governance. And that's why, they believe that isolation works. It's the only weapon that they think they have against the disease. So they're going to continue to do this because it means that this is regime legitimacy in China, because every case of coronavirus in China is a threat to Communist Party rule.
But Gordon, okay, so every case of coronavirus in China is a threat to Chinese Communist Party rule. But I've also read, and I defer to you on what's happening within China, but I've also read that these zero COVID policies are sowing dissent within the population. People are upset about being locked down. So, I keep looking at the way they've handled COVID, wondering, in some sense of humility, Gordon, what do they know that we don't? In another, attempt to be more calculated, I do think, well, this is their way to control their population. But then I ask myself, is it working if it's actually sowing dissent among the population?
They don't care. I mean, they obviously know that this is unhappy. But you got to remember that Li Chang, who was the Shanghai Party secretary, one responsible for those horrible COVID lockdowns in March and April, he looks like he not only is on the Politburo Standing Committee now, but it looks like he is going to, he is China's number 2. And it looks like he's going to be the premier of the state council starting next March. So, obviously they don't care because they believe that there are other things that they can obtain or that are important to them. This is a communist system. It's top down, and they are forcing the Chinese people into things that, obviously it's creating great amount of dissent. It's occurring at the time where there are other causes of concern among Chinese people that are making them angry. China is a very angry place right now. Communist Party knows it, and it believes that the way for it to go forward is extreme repression. And that's why China's moved. It's no longer authoritarian. You hear all these people say, oh, China's authoritarian. Well, no, it's not. I mean, I think it's totalitarian. One could say, well, it's only semi-totalitarian on the way to totalitarianism, but we can see where this is. And it's no longer the China of 5 years ago or the China of 10 years ago.
So you talked about the various things beyond COVID that are upsetting the Chinese population. You've written the book, The Coming Collapse of China. And I think in our past conversations, Gordon, we've talked about the fact that economically, China is a paper tiger. At least its reputation exceeds its actual, punching weight. That, yeah, they do have great economic influence on the world, but it's papered over with massive amounts of debt and false infrastructure projects. And I think that you've surmised then, well, there is a collapse in China's future because of this sort of house of cards that is their economy. But how do you balance that, your prediction there's this coming collapse of China, against this moment now that you're telling us as Americans, hey, we're on the precipice of something perilous?
We're on the precipice of something terrible, largely because China's facing simultaneous crises. So, for instance, you have plunging property prices, which are far more serious in China than it would be in our society, because the Chinese people use apartments as stores of wealth. So you got plunging property prices, an economy which I think is contracting, falling currency, debt crisis, companies defaulting one right after the other in the property sector, worsening food shortages, deteriorating environment, and as we've talked about, these fast-moving COVID outbreaks. When we listened to Xi Jinping's work report, which opened the 20th National Congress on the 16th, he did not talk about the things that really are of concern, which we've just discussed. He didn't talk about plunging property prices or youth unemployment, the things that really matter to the Chinese people. And the reason, Will, is because I believe that Xi Jinping knows he has no answer for it. So Xi Jinping's answer is to say, I'm going to distract the Chinese people by some adventure abroad. And that's why we've got to be concerned. We have seen him not only the fastest military buildup in history since the Second World War, but also he's mobilizing the Chinese civilians for war, civilian society. And when we saw the new Central Committee and his Politburo Standing Committee, he's got a war cabinet, as it's now been called. So the signs are there. Xi Jinping, we can't say, oh, he didn't warn us. So that's why, a China which is in distress is a far more dangerous China than one that is stable.
Okay, I want to talk about public relations for a minute, and in terms of China, it's maybe better characterized as propaganda. You said a minute ago, Gordon, for example, their COVID policies are an attempt to show the world that Chinese-style semi-totalitarianism or authoritarianism is better than democracy. Who is that targeted toward? Who is the subject of that propaganda campaign? Who are they trying to convince?
I think in this, there's multiple audiences, as there are often, but I think the primary audience are the Chinese people, because they want to show that democracy is no solution for problems. And then, of course, they try to undermine our society. And let's be clear about this. This is not just propaganda. They're trying to incite violence on American streets. They've been doing this consistently since 2020. The new report from Mandiant shows that these Chinese propaganda networks, which are undoubtedly run by Beijing, have been advocating civil war in the United States, have been advocating violence. Will, these are acts of war. This is not just subversion. These are acts of war. And we have a political class, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, who have decided that they are going to be oblivious about this. So, Biden's not doing anything about it. Trump, tried to do something, but was obviously inadequate considering what the Chinese were doing. All I can say is that we Americans have got to take our society back, because if we don't do that, we're going to lose our country, because China is making sure that they are doing everything possible to destroy our America.
Let's go back then to this concept of kinetic war. You said that you don't see perhaps, and we're going to have to come back to that idea of an inflection point, a desperate China that needs to act out abroad. But it seems to be China's approach for a long time now, Gordon, decades, that kinetic war is not the course of action with the West, that you can be patient, you can play the long game. And I don't want to try to, put Chinese foreign policy into just my own dumbed down, simplified words, but to play this game of unrestricted warfare where you participate in American culture, you participate in any adversary's life and society in ways that don't involve shooting a gun. What is that? I've read the reports about there's these Chinese police stations across the world, not just in America, but to control their own Chinese population across the globe, like shadow police stations.
Right.
Here could be in Dallas, a shadow police station in Dallas that controls the behavior of Chinese nationals in Texas, or whatever it may be, in the university system, in our culture. Give me some sense in your mind of the unrestricted warfare that China is playing right here in America.
Well, we know the most important one is, as I mentioned, the incitement to violence on American streets. That is a direct threat to the U.S. It's an act of war. You mentioned the police stations. And here, if you just let me give some context to this, because the New York Post reported that there is an unofficial police station on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which has been operated by a charity that has been on the IRS blacklist for failing to file reports. The questions Americans should ask, well, yes, the Chinese are assertive, they're violating our sovereignty. This is outrageous. And yes, that's all true. But the question Americans should ask is, why do the Chinese feel bold enough to be able to establish a fixed location on our soil? And the answer is because presidents, especially Obama, Trump, and Biden, knew that Chinese consular officials and Ministry of State security agents were acting almost openly on American soil and did nothing or virtually nothing to stop it. And to show you how egregious this is, last June on 42nd Street in New York, just outside the Chinese consulate there, a Chinese consular official brandishing a gun actually went out onto the pavement, which is sovereign American territory, threatening and harassing Americans who were demonstrating. I think it was Tibet. And the Chinese official got so violent that he actually inflicted facial injuries on a female photographer. Now, everybody complained to the New York Police Department, NYPD, and to the State Department, and nothing was done. So Americans should be saying, yeah, the Chinese are bad, but those who we elect to protect us have chosen not to do so. So this is an American issue more in my mind. And that's why the Chinese feel bold enough to open these police stations, because they have seen feeble policies. And this runs through our relations with China, where the Chinese engage in egregious, dangerous, belligerent, provocative behavior. And we know about it, we have the means to stop it, and our political leaders choose not to do so.
But, and I think for many people listening, Gordon, that story you just told about those Chinese police stations, it's simultaneously like, wow, that's happening here in America. But I don't know that I have my finger on the pulse of what the reaction to that might be. But I think it also can be dismissed by people as, well, how broad and how big of a problem is that within America? And then, so I think I want to broaden it, and you can answer that, but I think I want to broaden it to an undeniable place, and that is the cultural influence that China wields here in the United States of America. The most obvious example would be in Hollywood. We know, everyone knows. I hope everyone listening knows that we alter movies and content to suit Chinese needs so that we can meet the Chinese market, right? Sell it in China. And in order to do that, we have to meet the demands of the Chinese Communist Party, whatever that may be, right? And that's an obvious one. We also, I think many people listening will know the influence of China within academia. That it's funding research, high levels of influence with, again, their money, their dollars within academia. So my question for you is, again, please give me color, Gordon, on how deeply enmeshed the Chinese Communist Party's influence is here in America. But I also want you to answer why, because you pointed to three leaders, Obama, Trump, and Biden. Why is it that we're constantly underplaying or underestimating and, not appreciating, that we're ignorant of the Chinese influence? Or is it greed? Is that we're always bowing to our own capitalist instincts and China wields so much capitalist power?
Well, for various segments of the American population, there are various answers. So Wall Street, Walmart, yeah, that's greed. But it's also, we're Americans. We think that we're isolated and insulated from the world, protected from it, but we're not. I mean, there is a strain in American thinking that we don't have to pay attention to what our enemies say. We didn't pay attention to Osama bin Laden. He even killed 6 Americans in 1994 or something. And he says, whatever, America said, whatever. It took 9/11. It took almost 3,000 American deaths on one morning to wake up Americans. And that strain of obliviousness is now evident today in Washington. And it's not just the Biden administration. It's not just Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense. It's also the 3 and 4 stars in the Pentagon. So this rot is deep in American society. And that's why we can lose our country, Will, because the Chinese just keep pressing and pressing and pressing us all throughout.
But is that rot, just to be clear, is that rot, you're saying, obliviousness, even at the highest levels of leadership and government? Or is that rot corruption? And look, there's all kinds of corruption. There is literally Hunter Biden, perhaps Joe Biden level of corruption of being bought off, right? But there's also more subtle forms of corruption of, the constant power and influence of the Chinese dollar at every level of our economy.
Yeah, it's as I said, it's all the above, Will. And it's different for different segments of the population. So, you talked about academia. In academia, there's a number of things going on. First of all, especially in the scientific community, among American scientists in particular, they have this notion that scientists in other countries like China can't be evil, just can't be evil. They can't be doing what we Americans, common Americans, would think is just out and out maliciousness, but they are. And we saw this with Anthony Fauci, who you talk about corruption. I don't know what's going on there, but last year twice he answered questions from Rand Paul in the Senate under penalty of perjury that his National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases did not fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Will, there are 2 published papers by researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology describing gain-of-function research, which in the papers themselves specifically acknowledge funding from Fauci's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. One from 2016, one from 2017. And the corruption here is a subtle one, but that was clearly perjury. And as far as I know, the Justice Department is not investigating Fauci for a clear case or 2 clear cases of perjury. So this rot runs deep throughout the American society, at least in the political establishment.
Am I right, Gordon, that China's approach over several decades has been that long game of, I'm going to use this specific term, I think it has meaning, unrestricted warfare?
Yes, that's the title of a book from 1999 by 2 then Chinese Air Force colonels who then said China could do anything to destroy the United States. It's very clear, it's right out there. Now, Beijing denies that it has a doctrine of unrestricted warfare, but when we see what it has actually been doing, Will, it fits perfectly within the confines of that book. So, yes, and we have a Defense Department that is absolutely determined to talk to China. absolutely determined to try to develop those lines of communication, when what we should be doing is making sure that we intimidate the Chinese, that we deter them, because deterrence has broken down. And we don't have to speculate about that, because we can read Chinese propaganda, especially as Afghanistan fell, and we can hear what the Chinese diplomats said. I just arrived in Anchorage a couple days ago. I'm in Alaska now. In Anchorage in March of last year, China's top two diplomats, Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi, they started that open session with Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken. And they said, the United States can no longer talk to China from a position of strength, almost a direct quote. So it's clear we are not deterring the Chinese, and we don't seem to be doing those things right now to try to deter them. This is critical for us.
So the story of communism, Gordon, is, I think, both how can you suppress and control your population, but maybe more importantly, how can you control your own house, that it is always a house of snakes. And it comes down with betrayal and backstabbing. How significant, first, how unified is the Chinese Communist Party's view of how to approach the world behind Xi Jinping? Does everyone share this view that he does, that we have to conduct unrestricted warfare, we may be headed towards kinetic war, that the entire world is a zero-sum game, and China has to be at the top? How unified is the Chinese Communist Party behind that view, and what did you make then of that dramatic image of Xi Jinping's predecessor, Hu Jintao, being walked out of that congressional meeting? That was
chilling, and that was one of the most extraordinary events in the history of the People's Republic. Because what it showed was a couple things. And here, this is a warning. They could have done this in closed session. Matter of fact, it was a closed session until a few moments before that occurred. They had a closed session. They invited the journalists in. And then Hu Jintao, the immediate predecessor, was frog-marched out of the Congress session. So they wanted to intimidate not just Communist Party cadres and officials, because they could have done that in closed session, but they wanted to intimidate the Chinese people. And from our perspective, they wanted to intimidate us, because Xi Jinping was showing that he was in complete control. The question, you asked, how united is the Communist Party on various things? Well, on wolf warrior diplomacy, this extremely assertive approach to the world that Xi Jinping is associated with, I think that it's not shared by many people at all in the party, because they see that it's caused so much loss of support for China around the world. But does it matter? At least at the moment it doesn't, because Xi Jinping and his loyalists are in complete control. The question is... And what is that? Would you describe that for us really quickly? What is wolf warrior diplomacy? Wolf warrior diplomacy is basically unrestricted warfare. It's, China can do what it wants. It's... China should intimidate, threaten, coerce, grab land from neighbors, all of the above. So this is an extremely provocative Chinese approach. So, for instance, you will have Chinese ambassadors lecture countries on all sorts of things. Like the Chinese ambassadors to Canada are very adept at these just incredibly dismissive, derisive comments, openly trying to stir up hatred against whites in Canada. The former Chinese ambassador did that. Now he was transferred to France. These are the things that is a very provocative approach to the world. That's wolf warrior diplomacy. And I would take it, and a few more questions here with you, Gordon, but I would take it then the illustration you gave us earlier of sowing actual street violence in the United States of America as part of wolf warrior diplomacy. By the way, what are you talking about specifically on that? How did that happen? How did they seed the existence of street violence in the United States? So in 2020, Radio Free Asia reported that an intelligence unit of the People's Liberation Army based themselves in China's now closed Houston consulate. And from there, they used artificial intelligence and big data to identify Americans likely to participate, and this was specifically pointed out, Antifa and Black Lives Matters protests. And then they sent them TikTok videos on how to riot. Chen Weihua, who is China Daily's European bureau chief. China Daily is an official Communist Party publication. I think it was October 18th of 2020, tweeted that he was encouraging Americans to throw petrol bombs on American streets. And we've had reporting in just the last couple days from various sources. I think NBC News was the lead on this, that and the Wall Street Journal, both of them reported that these large Chinese propaganda networks, basically social media, were urging Americans to engage in civil war and acts of violence on American streets. These propaganda networks are not officially Communist Party or Chinese central government, but as the reporting from Mandiant, the cybersecurity firm, they clearly are run by the party or the central government. So these are acts of war. These are encouraging Americans to commit acts of violence.
All right, so let's take this full circle now. This moment that you feel we're sitting on, the precipice of something terrible, that we're in this perilous moment. For decades, the seeds have been sown with unrestricted warfare, integrating itself into our culture, our academia, into our economy, most importantly. I say that most importantly because I think at any moment of inflection, Americans as individuals and as leaders are going to say, are we ready to pay this economic price? It's going to be steep, by the way, any type of disentanglement with China. So the groundwork has been laid for decades. Now Xi Jinping has solidified power more cohesively. He's put generals, I read, at the top of almost everything. He has every general sharing his worldview. He's frog-marched Hu Jintao. He has power, and he's also desperate. And that's what you just find for us as well today. He's desperate economically. He's desperate to control his population. And that all leads to what, do you think? A country, a communist party that's been patient and laid the groundwork and now has the power but is getting desperate does what, Gordon?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that it is prepared for kinetic war. We've seen this with, as I mentioned, the military buildup, getting Chinese civilians ready for war. His war cabinet, as it's been called, put in place this week. So, I can't say that it's going to be Taiwan or South China Sea or East China Sea or India or whatever, but it's coming will. You know it because they talk about it. They are emotionally want to kill. They know, I think, that they shouldn't do it. But, we have not seen in history a militant regime get ready for war and then not engage in it. So history says that we need to be prepared. And what I can understand all that, but what alarms me is the failure of our political class. And this is not just liberal Democrats in the Biden administration. These are conservative Republicans as well, are determined for one reason or another that they will not defend ourselves. And the question that we have to ask is, what are our children and grandchildren going to think when they realize that we had the means to protect them but chose not to do so?
And then, therefore, the final question I'll have for you, what can we do to protect them? How should we prepare?
We should mobilize. First of all, we need to put not only more money into our military immediately on readiness issues. We need to not take planes and ships out of service. We need to get Americans prepared. I'll give you an example. Biden about a month ago at a Democratic Party fundraiser talked about the possibility of Armageddon, but he will not talk about that with the American people. Well, he needs to talk about that. He needs to say that we will defend our friends and allies, such as Taiwan. We do that, we can deter the Chinese. We can prevent them from attacking Taiwan, but we're not doing that. We just need to understand that the Chinese regime is unalterably opposed, sees us as an existential threat, not because of our policies, but because of who we are, our democracy and our values. We need to understand that this is a critical moment, perhaps the most critical moment in American history, and that we can and will lose our country unless we prepare.
All right. One last question I have to ask you out of my own curiosity. I have to assume that the position of the United States of America has not been to do nothing, that we must be doing something. Are we playing those same types of unrestricted warfare games on the offense in China, whether or not that's cyber warfare or sowing dissent within the Chinese Communist Party? Does the United States government also not have a long game, a long plan to do something offensive that ultimately then takes off the table kinetic war?
Both the Trump and Biden administrations have done some things, but those some things have been inadequate, especially considering the threat. We don't engage in what the Chinese do in terms of propaganda. That has completely been off the table for us. We are, in some sense, thinking about war. But when the Pentagon thinks about war, they said, well, it can't occur before 2027, and it's probably going to be in the middle of next decade if it occurs. Well, fortunately, last Wednesday, Admiral Mike Gilday, the chief of naval operations, said he couldn't rule out war this year. And he was right to make that rhetorical statement. But then he talked about plans for the Navy, which again just sort of assumed that war is a decade away from now. We need to actually match our actions with Admiral Gilday's rhetorical comments, but we're not, because I don't know. As I said, it's for different reasons for different people, but we do not have a political class that is determined to defend the American Republic at a moment of urgency.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.